Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and we welcome you to the Constitution Day 2021 Forum. Today, we are blessed to have with us Dr. Christy Woodberry Moore, Brother Patrick Mason, and soon to join us will be Dr. Earl Fisher. Constitution Day is something that we observe every year at Memphis Theological Seminary. And we every year have a very vibrant discussion about the Constitution and how certain aspects of it relate to the subject of theology as well as the church. So today we are really excited to have three wonderful panelists. And so we're going to begin our introductions. Dr. Christy Woodberry Moore, if you would introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Henry. I am the Assistant Professor of Spiritual Formation and the Director of Supervised Ministries. One of the projects that I'm actually working on is turning my dissertation, which is about using non-conventional sources for connecting with the lived experiences of Black women, trying to turn that dissertation into a resource for Black women to use in the community and in the church. You asked me to give a fun fact. So in my chemical engineering days, I have a small publication in chemical engineering education on binary molecular diffusion. That's right.
And for those of us who are challenged in the area of chemistry, you'll have to define.
I can't. I just have to send you the journal article because I can't even remember exactly what I did, but my name is there.
Okay. Our second panelist is Mr. Patrick Mason. Unmute yourself, Mr. Mason.
Sorry. I
No
appreciate
problem.
the opportunity to be here. I am just a student. I am taking Introduction to Interpretation of New Testament right now with Dr. Miner, but I've been practicing law in Memphis for 36 years. I do probate and estate planning law. I do not practice in the area of constitutional law. I will share with you, I took constitutional law about 38 years ago at Vanderbilt Law School, and I think I got a C. So I do not think of me as a constitutional scholar, but I will chime in with my thoughts as we go along. In terms of what I'm working on right now, I am actually, or something interesting about me, I have, as I was sharing with Fakisha earlier, I have completed, 4 years ago, I completed the Camino de Santiago, which is a 500-mile pilgrimage across northern Spain. I know Billy Vaughn has done that, and Brigitte French has done part of that. It transformed my life, and I actually wrote a book about it. It's called Candle on the Camino. So I have finished that book and shared it with many friends and family members, but that's the reason I'm here at MTS. But I'm happy to talk about separation of church and state and the First Amendment to the Constitution, and throw in my 2 cents worth.
We thank you, Brother Mason. And joining us also is one of the preeminent scholars that we have here in Memphis, Dr. Earl Fisher. Dr. Fisher, please introduce yourself, sir.
Good morning, Dr. Henry, and thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. When you said preeminent scholar, I was looking around on the Zoom trying to figure out who you were talking about. Thank you for that kind compliment. I'm Dr. Earl Fisher. I'm the senior pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Memphis, in the Whitehaven area. I am also an adjunct instructor of religion and philosophy at several institutions around the region. Now, more recently in this semester, I'm teaching some classes at Philander Smith College, which is the HBCU in Little Rock, as well as Eden Theological Seminary. I'm a graduate of MTS, class of 2008. I also teach classes at Memphis Theological Seminary, and so I'm honored to be part of that illustrious institution. If I was to share a fun fact, I would probably have to say I will be turning 43 on the 26th of this month, and so I'm excited to share in the celebration of life that is coming up Sunday after next. And another fun fact is somebody has to preach a sermon for Abyssinian this Sunday. So I guess it's going to be me after this is over.
Understood. Dr. Fisher, we wouldn't normally do this, but we want you to give a little 15-second plug for your upcoming publication.
Well, I'm sure people are tuned in, and some of those who love me, like my wife and others, colleagues, probably rake me over the coals saying, I'm glad you did this, Dr. Henry. You saved me a lot of scrutiny because I'm not good at self-promotion. I have a forthcoming book. It is coming out in Lexington Press. It is about Albert Clegg Jr. and the Black prophetic tradition. And so it is available on the Lexington Books website. I'll be glad to share the link in this Zoom session and on the Facebook stream that I know is going live. So thank you for that opportunity. It'll be coming out hard copy in November. And so I'm excited about sharing in that. So thanks again, Dr. Henry.
Oh, you're quite welcome. And let me say again, we are excited about this discussion. And I also have to say, in order to keep ourselves in order, that the views and opinions expressed by our panelists are not necessarily the views and opinions of Memphis Theological Seminary. So we are free to have an open and frank discussion about this very important topic. The first question I want to address is, what is the intent of the establishment and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights? And for people that don't know, the establishment clause of the First Amendment refers to the phrase that says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The exercise clause says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So let me, Dr. Woodberry Moore, I'll throw that to you first, and then everyone else, if you will join in.
You don't care about me. Let me just put that out there right now. You don't care about me. All right, so I did some reading and some research. I just finished Pulpit and Politics by Dr. Marvin McMichael, which is a very good book on getting historical information on the separation of church and state and some of the issues that have come up over the years as it relates to that. And so out the gate, the actual intent of the clause was really to rid the colonies of the empire known as the Roman Catholic Church, because at the time, the Catholic Church was the established religion and the established church of the monarch and those who are in the elite. And so even as we're thinking about the intent, the First Amendment regards religious freedom. It's ultimately about power and control. And so while Thomas Jefferson or even Roger Williams may not have thought about me or my people when they were crafting this, it meant that the government would not use its force or power to favor any theology or policy views of one religious group over another, and that the government will not decide which religious tradition will or will not be able to function in this country. And so no religious organization will be used as a collective influence to shape policy that will conform to a particular theological view, which really means that the government will protect those who are in the religious minority as well. I know I said a lot. I read.
Not a problem. That was very, that helps us couch this question in a framework. Either one of our other panelists, Brother Mason, Dr. Fisher, if you would like to chime in.
I want to yield to Mr. Mason first. I definitely have some things I want to offer, but him being somebody who is in the legal field, I want to yield to his perspective and expertise first.
Okay.
Well, let's, I will, Dr. Woodberry Moore talked about a book. I'm going to reference a book called Separation of Church and State by Philip Hamburger, which is a fabulous treatise. I read it about 9 years ago. It's pretty much it's the gospel, but it shares with us more of a history of this. So any of the people who are participating through Facebook today with us wanting to know more about separation of church and state, Philip Hamburger's book is a great treatise on that. The key point that I want to emphasize in what Dr. Woodberry Moore said is that it is a one-directional prohibition. Separation of church and state is it references to Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association back in 1802, which was creating a wall which is separating on both sides. But the language is very clear in the First Amendment that it's a one-directional prohibition. The government shall not act in such a way as to establish a religion. And I think what the intent was back then was a one-directional prohibition. But as that phrase has moved forward, and even going into 1947, when we had case law in which the Justice Douglas incorporated the phrase separation of church and state into a constitutional issue, we really have not had, the history, the long history of this being separation, meaning a two-directional prohibition. So I think when we look at the concept of separation of church and state, we have to not look at it as that was the intent to have government separate from the religious community and the religious community separate from the government. It was strictly prohibiting government from entering into the field of establishing a religion.
Yeah,
Mason?
yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to add to this in terms of the frame, because I want to confess at the offset that this is a rather complicated conversation to have, because there are so many moving pieces. And so to even enter the conversation at the entry point of the First Amendment might do us a little disservice, because you might ask, like, what are we amending? Well, we would be amending the United States Constitution. I'll definitely yield to Brother Mason insofar as that's concerned. But I would want to approach this as a theologian primarily, who uses rhetoric as one of the entries to discuss and analyze theology. So there are some philosophies that give rise to the Constitution in and of itself. One would be John Locke's natural rights philosophy. And so this idea that God has endowed human beings with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness in the United States Constitution. Locke would say the pursuit of property. And I think that this is important distinctions to make, because it kind of sets the groundwork for this messy relationship between politics and religion or theology. And even to talk about the First Amendment in its original context is helpful, but in our contemporary context, most of us see the distinguishing between church and state, not simply insofar as this notion of the government not, at least not supposed to be advocating for the establishment of a national religion, but the reality is the United States, by most objective references, I would yield to Aubrey Hendrick's more recent book, but he has plenty of them that are out there. But his most recent book about Christianity against Christians against Christianity and the role of white evangelicalism in the shaping of the political landscape, which is consistent. Brother Mason brought up Thomas Jefferson. I think that's a wonderful place to start, because in the notes of Thomas Jefferson, I mean, there's definitely some theological claims that are being made that help shape his contribution to the development of the country. But most of us don't even think about the relationship between church and state insofar as the First Amendment is concerned. We just have that in the backdrop. We think about it in what's more so in terms of the Johnson Amendment, LBJ's amendment in the 1950s, I think it was, that he was basically using to try to offset one of his political opponents who he felt like was leveraging nonprofit organizations, even though churches were not involved. So the concept of church and state is complicated in terms of its distinctions, because if you look at some of the founding documents, there's already theological and religious overtones and undertones and explicit content within it that we would have to analyze from a couple of different perspectives to try to get the broadest sense of how these things interrelate. But I want to affirm again that the identity that has developed of the country since its foundings in relationship to religion has been a white evangelical Christian nationalism. We've seen that even played out in the more recent years.
Absolutely. And that's actually, you're leading into my second question. Is there a difference between the 18th century interpretation of this statement and the 21st century interpretation? And if there's a difference, what is that difference? I'll throw that. Go ahead.
Well, if you don't mind, I think that there is the initial intent, but I think we also have to be aware, just like Dr. Fisher has mentioned, that there is also the broader impact of religious freedom and religious liberty that is at stake. And when we talk about this idea of separation of church and state, right? And so oftentimes we typically just think in terms of when and how I can worship, but it is beyond that. It goes into LGBTQIA, their civil rights. It goes into reproductive justice. It goes into how we consider those who are coming out of prison who may be atheists, but they are now having to go into a group home where it's faith-based. And so now they have to follow the rules of the group home and not have the freedom of worshiping or not worshiping because they don't want to go back to jail, right? So when we're thinking about this idea of separation of church and state and religious liberty, I'm not sure we are thinking in the broader sense of who is impacted, right? Who is burdened by the decisions we are making as it relates to religious freedom? And are we making these decisions based on a theological or religious conviction, or are we making them based on the health and safety of humanity, right? And so I think we have to think in terms of that. So I think the interpretation is where we're lacking in many areas. We do not see the broader picture and the impact of our decisions, or even the government's decisions against and for certain things. Like when we think about what's happening in Texas, the 6-week the abortion ban that has been passed as relates to women who cannot get an abortion after the 6 weeks. And then for those of us who will take them to a clinic to get the abortion, whoever sees me do that can get a $10,000 from me for my actions in helping them, right? And so even as we think in terms of what does that mean, and what is the reasoning behind making decisions like that? Is it a theological, religious conviction type reasoning, or is it about the health and safety of the woman? And I think we have to really consider what that means when we consider how we are interpreting this amendment.
True. Dr. Fisher.
It seemed like Dr. Mason was chomping at the bits. Please do, brother.
Go ahead, sir.
I don't know if I'm chomping at the bits, but this is really complicated, guys, and it's not an end result discussion. I'm not taking one position or another. This is about trying to look at the Constitution and the amendments in an objective way. What I want to say today is what I have experienced in my professional career, and that is that the difference here in the interpretation of separation of church and state is there is this caution in the work world specifically. That's what I've dealt with as a lawyer and previously as a CPA, of this timidity of dealing with religious issues, because you don't talk about religion in the workplace. It's dangerous to talk about political issues in the pulpit. So there is this timidity that I think is counterproductive to where we are as, let's presume we're Christians here, or our whatever theological identity we have. And that timidity is impacting our ability to communicate with each other and our ability to try to use our belief system to influence what's going on in government. As a personal example, I remember the difficulty of when we changed the laws in Tennessee about the lottery. And that was a big issue at that day. And so the preachers who chose to preach from the pulpit about that may have had some positive impacts, but they may have had some significant negative impact. And a lot of preachers didn't talk about it because they didn't want to go there. So what I want to say is that to piggyback on what I said earlier, this is a one-directional prohibition, and to the extent that a religious group seeks to or refuses to take a stand, a political stand on an issue, they're doing so out of their own timidity and not because the Constitution prohibits from that. And I think we ought to learn from that lesson that we shouldn't consider ourselves unable to, or we shouldn't be unwilling to pronounce what we believe the principles of justice that God calls us to be and exercise. We shouldn't be timid about pronouncing that, because the Constitution does not prohibit that. It does not create a separation of church and state that puts some kind of a block on our ability to talk about that.
I completely agree with Brother Mason and Dr. Woodberry Moore insofar as we should resist the timidity to speak out based upon our deepest convictions, that we should also be informed on the history and the trajectory of interpretation. I mean, and the irony of the moment that we're in, especially in light of what Dr. Woodberry Moore just brought up. And again, Brother Mason can help me with this. I'm not trying to clamor like I'm some constitutional law scholar. However, I do know that right now, just about every legal analyst has said that what is happening in Texas is unconstitutional. Nevertheless, there are no judges up to this point that have ruled at the federal level about what is happening, even though there's like this clear consensus, and that it would violate the precedent that has been set forth by the Supreme Court prior to this point. And I think what that speaks to, that is also important in what Brother Mason and I agree, and I'm sure Dr. Woodberry Moore would agree too, is just a complicated conversation because of these mythologies that exist among us, is that the law is not self-interpreting, just like scriptures are not self-interpreting, that there are experiences and cultural, social, political contexts that go into the establishment and the development of them. Oftentimes people in modern times are not familiar with the historical context or are anachronistic insofar as trying to apply contemporary understandings and experiences into what has happened in times past, which does not do a disservice to those in the past, nor does it serve well those in the present. And I think this is, at the risk of sounding coy or too controversial, God forbid I sound controversial, I think this is where, critical race theory as a legal field, which was its foundations, is helpful, because part of what it argued, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins and others, what they were arguing is that the law itself is not self-interpreting, and that there are angles by which the law gets interpreted on behalf generally of people who have unbridled and unchecked power. And if that is true, then we have to wrestle with Augustine in what he talked about insofar as unjust laws are concerned. And then again, we see it playing out in modern times, not just with this law in Texas, but even with the ways in which the laws have been applied about First Amendment rights relative to what happened on January 6th, what happened at plenty state capitals around the country versus what tends to happen at other protests and demonstrations that are led in defense and in defense of and in solidarity with those who advocate for the dignity and the humanity of Black lives. So again, I agree that it is a complicated conversation. And my primary point in this particular section would just be, it matters who is writing these laws. It matters who interprets these laws, because ultimately all laws, just like all theology, is concerned with power, which is why I tend to say all theology is political.
Go ahead.
If I might just respond a little, just briefly, to your comment about the Texas law being unconstitutional. And I will reflect back to 38 years ago when I was taking con law, and we were reading and studying Roe versus Wade. The interpretation of the penumbra, my constitutional law professor called it the penumbras and emanations of the First Amendment. And so the question is, does the interpretations of a document written 200 and whatever 30 years ago, does that evolve over time? And I think it does. And I agree with your comment. It's just, I don't know that we can call it unconstitutional at this point, because because that definition of or what constitutes a penumbra and emanation of the rights of the protected rights of American citizens, that may evolve over time. I don't know that that's an absolute concept. So that's my response.
I want to share something though, as we are just kind of talking about this, because my work at the seminary is in spiritual formation, helping to form faith leaders to do effective and meaningful ministry in the community and in the world, right? And so this conversation about separation of church and state, the First Amendment, religious freedom, religious liberty, whatever words you would like to use, I think it's very important to the work that I do, because I want to help develop faith leaders who are not simply religious tolerant, but embrace religious diversity, even if that means no religion at all, but not just embrace it, because we might say, oh, I embrace you, I'll hold your hand, I'll shake your hand, I'll give you a hug. But what I mean by make room for them at the table, to see them as equal, even if they're an atheist, even if they do not believe any of what we believe, right? But to make room and to show that you're making room for them at the table. I think the other thing, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, is that oftentimes when we make decisions, I'm not sure we're saying who benefits and who is burdened. If we can answer those questions, we can see where the power is leaning. Is it the religious majority that is benefiting, or those who we are making invisible by the decision that we're making? And oftentimes, because I am a Black woman, and my history, my heritage, my ancestry is from Africa, so I have a bias as a Black woman as it relates to anything that would push me further to the margins that I'm already at, right? And so any kind of law, policy, or any kind of decision that is made that will further push me, my people, and those who are marginalized further to the margins, then I'm always asking the question, is this benefiting my people? Is it benefiting me? Where is the power really, right? We say it's freedom, but it's not really, because somebody has some power here and I do not. And so how do we have equity in that area? So before being asked to be a part of this panel, while I had my ideas in thinking about religious freedom, I had my own position and perspectives that I had not shared. This is a very critical conversation in the seminary in general, not just, for the Constitution Day, but this is very critical as we are forming faith leaders that will go out in the community and will be asked to pray at certain things and need to be sensitive to those who may not pray to our God, but may pray to Allah, right? We have to be sensitive to that. We're asking people to pray, but are we allowing them the space to pray in the way that they desire, right? And so as I'm thinking about this is critical as it relates to how we are forming faith leaders, how we're forming even those of us in our churches. Are we having this conversation about religious freedom, or are we basically just telling people go out and convert by any means necessary, just convert them, all of them, to Christianity because it's what I believe? Just kind of throwing it out there.
Right, and that is being a Christian. When we were growing up, that's what we were taught. Christianity, everybody that's Christian is right. And if you're not Christian, if you're Muslim, if you're Buddhist, if you are what have you, then we need to go out and talk to convert, proselytize people. But then as I got older, I began to learn about universalism and the fact that there are many paths to heaven. Some people are not taking my path. That does not necessarily mean that they won't see God. And unfortunately, as you were saying, the way our Constitution is framed in many respects points to a very narrow road, as opposed to broadening the road to really allow everyone to be a part. And we don't want to marginalize. I totally agree with you, Dr. Woodberry Moore. There's enough marginalization in the world without us purposing to do it and using laws to try it. So with that, let me pause for a second and say, please click like and share. Please share this with somebody. And if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in our Facebook chat, and I will do my best to get to you as soon as I can. Now, next, earlier we spoke about the wall that Thomas Jefferson had mentioned in 1802. And I'm just curious if we could speak a little more about what exactly does it mean when he said a wall of separation between the church and state was erected. Why is it a wall? Why use that terminology? Don't speak at once, everybody.
So I'll try to take a stab at this as, somebody trained in theology and in rhetoric. I think all metaphors have some usage, but none of them are perfect. Yes. And I think it's hard to not, again, speaking of what I said earlier about anachronism, in the modern context, when we think about notions of walls, it would evoke, some of the Trump rhetoric insofar as this physical means of trying to border or distinguish or separate between one entity and another. The Thomas Jefferson's theology and rhetoric and politics are just complicated and complex. I'd leave that to the section that Ibram X. Kendi has in his book, Stand from the Beginning, that talks about how the origins of racist ideas are in a lot of ways contributed to the political philosophy, ideology, and theology of Thomas Jefferson and others like Cotton Mather. But I think what is important insofar as something that Dr. Woodberry was mentioning, and I think is the idea of the Constitution itself being, no, this is something you just said, Dr. Henry, I think, but the Constitution itself, the notion of religion is not rooted in Christian ideology or philosophy, it's deism. And so I don't find anything within the constitutional language itself, the content of the Constitution itself, that kind of points towards a Christological worldview. There is some religious sentiment within it, but that religious sentiment, I think, has been adopted and adapted and in some ways manipulated by a white evangelical Protestant power structure that then deploys this constitutional language and conflates notions of patriotism and a particular view of Christianity in ways that help them to obtain and maintain social, political, and religious power. And so these are the things that I think have to be unearthed so that when we do start talking about the relationship between religion and politics, or God and country, if you will, we're able to specify exactly who, and this is the point that I think Dr. Woodberry Moore is bringing out very well, who within the power structure is benefiting from the usage and the deployment of these terms in the way in which they are understood, and how faithful is that? The same thing that preachers need to learn to do with scripture, right? How faithful is this to the original intent and inspiration, text and context of the scripture or the Constitution? So those are things, again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, make this a complicated conversation. But Thomas Jefferson's notion of wall, I think it is clear that he and the founding fathers were very much willing to separate between groups insofar as the development of not just a country, but a power structure, and ultimately now an empire is concerned.
Well, let me jump in and say that I understand what you're saying, Dr. Fisher. I think it's important. I mean, you asked the question, what does the wall mean? I think it just means that there was an intent of a dual directional prohibition on engagement and involvement. But I think if you push forward a few decades to what Hamburger refers to as the usage of the separation of the church and state against Catholics by native Protestants who were using that approach to avoid having Catholics in the public sphere. So it was being used in the direction of selective ability and access to the public government process. So I think Jefferson was trying to keep everything separate. It was his wish and desire that the government and religious groups be separate and apart. But we've seen it evolve over time. So just in the construct of a historical analysis, we've got an evolution of this whole thing, and I think the conversation is headed towards where are we today? And God, it's a mess. It's a mess.
It is. It truly is. Dr. Fisher, you alluded to patriotism and power, God and country. And something that has always troubled me is if we are supposed to be a nation where there is this separation between civic and sacred, then why is it so patriotic to be a godly person? Why is it so patriotic to say that I am a Bible-toting, scripture-quoting, tongue-talking, fire baptized Christian? Why is that so patriotic?
This is where we have to be just more honest about the historical realities that are contradictions at best and evil methods of governance at worst. And that's why I think it's peculiar that Thomas Jefferson would be the one front and center in our discourse about the relationship between religion and politics, because I mean, he writes about theology a lot in stuff like Notes. So he's telling you what he thinks, even as we know he's engaged in what we would probably call in the 21st century, at least anybody trying to be mildly objective, some ungodly behavior, as Sally Hemings. But my point here in terms of the idea of piety and God and country and patriotism kind of being conflated is again to ask us to disaggregate the power dynamics that give rise to that language and terminology. James Cone, Andre Johnson, and others say theology is God talk, which is to say, how are we talking about God? And the reason I say that all theology is political is because it's ultimately concerned about power. But all theology is also experiential because it takes place in human experience, and it's contextual because that experience is always taking place in a social, political, cultural, geographical, and chronological context. So these words, these phrases about God and country and patriotism in application to the religious majority, I agree with Brother Mason insofar as the way that the Catholics were treated because they were still religious minorities, but they still had access to certain elements of social and political power because they were ethnic majority. And so there are ways and tiers in which the reason this is complicated and messy, and I can't remember exactly what the term was Brother Mason used to say how tense the time is now, is because we don't tend to be honest about the conflicting and hypocritical nature of these claims, how they develop in ways that seem to be trying to appeal to a God that we would say is loving and just of all people, but at the same time, a God who does distinguish with favor and covenant between certain people and certain groups who, at the very least, pledge allegiance to certain ideologies, even if they don't necessarily live them out. So for me, if you want to know where we stand as a country historically and even into the present, insofar as our religious identity is concerned, look at what happens with things like 9/11, right? And what kind of laws were crafted in response to that? Who, to Dr. Woodberry Moore's point, who did those laws benefit? Who did those laws burden? And then start walking your way back, right? And so again, the rhetorician in me and the rhetorical theologian in me is saying, let these texts speak for themselves insofar as what they say, and then compare what these texts, these constitutional texts, these legal texts, and these religious texts say in comparison to how people are living them out daily. And I think what we will see is not some synthesized or unified trajectory. What we're going to see is some competing narratives and some competing realities and perspectives. And then it becomes our responsibility as public theologians, as legal scholars, to be honest about the decision, to be honest about the perspectives and the clash and the tension, and then make our decision to pick a side on which one we're going to advocate for.
Dr. Woodberry Moore, would you like to chime in on that one?
I was just going to share, as I was listening to Dr. Fisher speak, I remember a handout from that Dr. Katie Cannon gave her class. It was called The Hierarchies of Oppression. And on that handout, it kind of laid out certain categories: race, gender, sex, all of that, religion, all of that. And on it, you could see on the top of the line, those, the level of those who are not oppressed based on where they fall on the line, right? And so depending on where you fall on this hierarchy, you could see where those on the bottom, religious minorities, things of that sort, you would see them on the bottom of the line, because as we think about American society, we could see the hierarchies of oppression that happens in every avenue we might find ourselves in. And so as he was kind of talking about, when you shared patriarchy and you shared patriotism and you shared this idea of a Bible-toting Christian, I wasn't thinking, you might have been thinking Black, but I wasn't. I was thinking a white male.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't thinking a Black man or a Black woman or Hispanic or an Asian person. I was thinking a Black male, because in my thinking, when I think of Bible-toting patriotism and even the flag, the images that come into my mind are not Black people, but images of white men. Because as we think about how we've been socialized and what we have seen and the messages that we see and things that have happened in America, we can see how that is the image of power and control that we tend to see when we think about patriotism. And so even as you were just kind of talking about that, that was what just kind of popped up in my mind, because at the end of the day, I think as Dr. Fisher has said, it is about power, it is about control. And I think we have to just acknowledge it, just say that's what it's about. And then we have to decide, like you said, on what side we shall choose.
Absolutely. I have a question from our Facebook audience. Again, please click like and share, let people see and hear what we are discussing and how we are feeling. We have a question from David Bush. This is a bit of a tangent, but it's applicable. How do you feel about congregations accepting PPP funds during the pandemic?
Is this about the CARES Act? Is that what you're talking about? Okay.
Yes.
Come on, Dr. Woodberry Moore, you were unmuted. You're supposed to just lean in.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really clear on what he's actually asking, because I feel like he's asking something underneath that. But is it that congregations should not receive PPE funds because they don't have people in their congregations that need help and protection against COVID-19? Are we suggesting that they should not, and so thus, because they are the church, those funds need to be given somewhere else? I mean, is that what we're saying? So don't protect the church, protect everyone. What, Dr. Fisher? Don't.
No, I'm saying, I mean, I share that.
Don't protect the
curiosity.
church, because there's a separation. So the people in the church just get it, and everybody else don't get it. Talk to me.
So I share your curiosity in terms of what may be underneath the question. I think my first impulse is simply, what do we feel about churches receiving grant funds in general? And I mean, I don't have a problem with it, especially if they are used to the ends of the uplift of the community and society. And if government is good for anything, it should be good for the support of, you know, who the scripture would call the least, the last, and the lost. And if you look at the way the pandemic has economically and medically impacted communities of color, where so many of our churches are, right, and how they have been disproportionately impacted negatively. I mean, what was the name of it? Was it Shake Shack or something like that? One of those major corporations that ended up having to give up some of the money. Even some of the NBA teams had to give up some of the money. So
he's frozen, but I agree that, you know, as we're thinking about funding and grant funding and using those funds the way that they have been intended so that those might be protected against COVID or any other disease or illness or anything that's happening in society that will push people to the margins or have to have extra health care. Absolutely, we need to be on top of that. As a matter of fact, we need to be writing the grants. We need to be thinking about the other resources that may be available so that we might be able to provide the congregation with the tools and equipment so that they might be safe and healthy and able to live a quality of life. And so as we think about not only just the PPE funding, but any funding that the government that provides, and we are able to complete the application and do what we need to do on our side, the due diligence that is necessary so that we might use them to better our community. Absolutely. Let's sign me up, show me where the application is so that I can start the process of writing the necessary grants so that we might get the things that we need. I hope that's answering David's question.
It sounds like it is, Brother Mason.
I think it's a great question, and I understand the previous answers. I know my church accepted PPP payments because it was offered, but given the fact that churches are not paying taxes and this is trying to support, I just think it begs the question of, do we really have separation of church and state? And the government's offer of this in a time of an economic crisis, supporting all businesses, recognizing churches as businesses. So it's further muddied the circumstances and situation of what we think of as the separation of church and state. But I certainly understand that you get what's put on the plate. You take advantage of those circumstances. But I think it is just like in funding of parochial schools with the voucher system and that sort of thing. We are muddying that whatever you want to call it, a wall, a line, a one directional or a two directional prohibition, however you want to call it, it's just muddy.
That is, I totally, I agree with that. That the fact that we get into dangerous, murky water when we talk about federal or state funds that do anything in the church, because there is a camp that says, as Dr. Woodberry Moore said, why not? We are part of the community. There are hundreds of people. There are churches here in Memphis that have thousands of members that have been helped because of that. And if we limited it, then you would have people in the community that would go without. And so I agree with you. We have to be very open-minded as far as those kinds of that kind of distribution of funds. We are hoping and seeing if Dr. Fisher is able to get back on. He had a technical glitch, but I believe he will be back on as soon as that is fixed. But we do need to move forward quickly. In light of this wall that we've talked about, the supposed Jeffersonian wall, how can we justify laws that have banned same-sex marriage, abortion, school prayer, and segregationist laws, even invasion of foreign governments based on religious principles? How do we justify those in light of this supposed wall, if this wall is really supposed to exist?
I don't think we can. I mean, I think we, how do I say? I don't think we can justify laws that devalue human dignity in the name of religion or religious convictions. I think that they can't be justified. Now, I think the question that we have is, how is it that we have them anyway? How is it that we can't justify them? We know that they're based and grounded in some conviction that is personal. Even if it's a part of the religious majority, it's still a personal conviction. Yet at the same time, we still have them. And so I think we have to be honest with the fact that the church and the state have always been in bed together. And they get out of bed oftentimes based on who wants, on the advantage of what's the advantage or the benefit of getting out. But on most days, they like to stay in bed together. And so we have laws that represent that. Think about the blue laws that are sometimes still are in existence in some states, where you can't purchase a car on Sunday, or you can't buy liquor and all these kinds of things. Well, that's because the religious majority went to church on Sunday. But what about the rest of the people? Why can't they buy a car? They're not at church. They need a transportation, right? That's right. So this is a prime example. The blue laws in general is a prime example of the ways that the church and the state are in bed with one another. Yet we only get up and leave when it's beneficial to otherwise we're going to stay that way, because again, this is about power and control.
Absolutely.
If I could chime in here, I struggle with this. Specifically, let me drill down to school prayer, because that's an issue of concern for me. And I'm going to personalize it for just a second. And I had a brother-in-law that was Jewish, and he described to me in his early years, his formative years in grade school, they were praying in schools and public schools up in Buffalo, New York, where he lived. And it was, he said it was traumatic for him to be sitting in a class where they were referencing a religion that wasn't his faith. And, it made a lot of sense to me and sort of convicted me at that point that, we don't want to establish a religion, and we don't want to prohibit people from being able to have a religion. But out of love and compassion for those who are different from us, we need to, I believe in my heart that if a teacher who is a state actor is engaged in the process of leading a prayer, that is a form of religion, and puts us in a place where, unfortunately, the state is establishing a religion which is unconstitutional. So in trying to be consistent with what I've said earlier, that doesn't mean that a student can't lead a prayer. It doesn't mean that non-state actors can't come in and create an environment in which there is a spiritual moment. But I think there is, you asked the question, how can we justify laws against school prayer? I can justify that easily in my heart of hearts as far as public schools go. And I believe that's consistent with my faith belief.
Yeah, so first let me apologize for the lack of internet stability. That's kind of what happens when you got Xfinity. But let me also say, don't laugh too hard, Brother Mason. I'm gonna send you the cable bill. You could give me better broadband. Now, seriously, so I would piggyback with Brother Mason insofar as 2 points that I would want to accent. One, just this whole notion of what prayer is seems to be confined to a particular understanding associated with a particular group of people. I read a scripture that said you should pray without ceasing, and that everybody should pray and not faint. So I don't even know, for those of us who subscribe to the African idea of an omnipresent God that's everywhere at the same time,
and the idea that God can hear our thoughts. How can you take prayer out of anywhere? Anywhere that the person is, prayer can be enacted. The idea, and this goes back to the association with the individuals, is this notion of corporate prayer. And I don't believe that we should impose the experiences of corporate prayer on people who may not subscribe to a particular religion. And so this conflict generally starts when those who feel like they are in the religious majority are then no longer allowed to impose their religious ideologies and practices on a religious minority. There have been people who have had to lobby to be able to practice the Islamic prayers that must take place throughout the day, so that now they have to get a religious exemption. That has not always been the case. My last point that I would make here is that if you want to know if there has been a long-standing conflation of religion and politics in this country, which I think all of us would agree there has been, go to the court system and ask why until recent years people had to put their hand on a Bible in order to swear an oath before the court. And you have people who did all kinds of demonstrations and protests, and people who are asking that the Ten Commandments be erected in some of the courthouses. So it's clear that it is there. The question would be, again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, who does these conflations of religion and power and politics benefit, and who do they burden? And what does this mean when we make claims about being a country that's about liberty and justice for all, and a country that some would say is a God-fearing country or even a Christian nation, and others would say is one that should have no religious identity or no corporate or state-sanctioned religion?
Dr. Woodberry Moore, you have any thoughts?
No, I think that I think you're right on, and I think even as we consider the Afghan refugees that have come here seeking protection, that we will see even in spaces where they will live and navigate, that we will see how tolerant or free they can be in their worship and their ability to move and be in American society. We'll be able to see that. And my hope and prayer is that wherever they are residing, that they might find solace, and that they may feel free enough to worship in the ways that make them comfortable, and that they do not feel uncomfortable in spaces where they are the religious minority.
I have, this time has gone by very quickly. So to wrap it up, this actually may open up an entire new debate, but that'll be all right too. So final question is, what is our responsibility as the church to influence the state? What are the pros and cons of the church getting involved in state matters?
So again, I think I want to say that these things overlap in some ways that are innate, whether we like it or not, and to not admit it or acknowledge it, I think would do those who need advocacy and empowerment a disservice. Some might say that the church should be the conscience of the state. And I'm not averse to that, but I'm also mindful of the fact that appeals to moralism alone historically have not accomplished what I think people who are oppressed and marginalized and exploited necessarily need. What I would hope is this, and it makes me think about something that happened while I was at MTS. My last year, I was in a preaching practicum, and everybody had to preach a sermon, and I preached and brought up some political issues. And at the time, I didn't have the language to say, some of the things that I say now as an academician in terms of all theology being political. But what I said to the people who, I had some classmates who kind of sort of took issue with some of what I said, not the merit of it, but just the fact that I brought in politics to the pulpit, to which I said, I come from a religious tradition that simply has never had the luxury of separating church and state as it relates to our well-being. And that I stand in a Black prophetic tradition that requires me to speak the truth as I best understand it, a loving truth, a liberating truth, but a truth nonetheless, as I best understand it, and call us into a certain state of existence. Walter Brueggemann will call it a prophetic imagination that would cause us into a more holistic and just state of being. But I think about what Jeremiah Wright said about prophetic theology, which is that it is a theology of liberation, it is a theology of transformation, and it is a theology of reconciliation. So our responsibility is to stand in the tradition that says all people should be liberated because we are made in the image and the likeness of God, that should transform the society so that it would be more just and equitable to all humanity. And then if there are divisions amongst us in terms of relationships, we should be able to reconcile that way. That's what I think the church ultimately is responsible for. But I don't think we had a luxury of trying to live into what ultimately, for me, if I were drawing a hard line, I would say is a mythical line of demarcation between church and state.
All right. Would anyone else like to?
Well, let me respond to that with sort of a particular focal point, and that is my reintroduction to this subject matter of separation of church and state came about 9 years ago when I have a passion for my alma mater, the University of Notre Dame, became involved in some litigation with the Obama administration, who was forcing upon them to have a healthcare plan that included abortion. And that policy was in direct conflict with the core belief system of this Catholic university. I am not Catholic, but I appreciate and love the Catholicism of that university. And you know, I think you asked the question, what is our responsibility in that situation? The responsibility is to be true to your faith. Whatever your faith calls you to be, to say, to do, that's your duty to stand up and fight. I would have thought less of our university if they succumbed to whatever mandates were being forced upon them. And so I just say, quit the timidity. Fight the fight. If you believe whatever you believe, if it's your faith does not believe that a lottery is a fair and reasonable law to have on the books because it's going to lead to disaster for humankind, then fight it. I just think that the separation of church and state is it's an inaccurate assessment of what the law is. The law says Congress shall make no laws establishing a religion. That does not prohibit in any way a religious organization from responding to laws forcing them to have abortions in their healthcare plan or anything else. It's time to fight back in the circumstances of anything in which it's a conflict with your faith.
Dr. Woodberry Moore, you have the last word.
Absolutely. It is critical that the church involves itself in the affairs of the state. The church is made of human citizens, and human citizens are positively or negatively impacted by the decisions made by the government. So the church needs to be intimately involved in the political process. And by this, I mean fully aware of its limitations, right? We have the fair play law on what you can and cannot ask politicians that come in, but fully engaged, because how do you change an unjust law? Well, you need to be a part of the political process, not only on the voting side, but some of the members need to be elected officials. When I worked in Richmond, Virginia, I served as the executive pastor for Dr. Dwight C. Jones, who was the mayor at the time of Richmond. He was serving his second term. And he was the mayor. He was working on behalf of the people, not just the people in his church, but the people in the city of Richmond. And so as we're thinking about the ways in which the church needs to be involved, there needs to be letter writing campaigns that we need to write to our elected officials, student council, school council, student council, and our city council members and things, school board, that's what I meant, and our city council as well. We need to be a polling place. Why? Because our church has been the center, the epicenter of our community. So if you want us to come to the polls, why can't the polling place be at the church? Why is that an issue, right? And so the church needs to be intimately involved in order for things to change and shift. And so, yes, allow the politicians to come and talk and share what they believe. But at the end of the day, we can make our own decisions based on what we need in our community, but we cannot be absent of the process simply because we think that separation of church and state means uninvolvement.
Thank you,
Well
Dr.
said.
Thank you, Dr. Woodberry Moore, Brother Patrick Mason, and Dr. Earl Fisher. We at Memphis Theological Seminary are grateful that you took the time out of your day. And all of you have very busy lives. And so we are so grateful that you took this time to join us. And we just want to say to our listening audience, these types of discussions go on at Memphis Theological Seminary. So if you're interested, if you have any inkling or any thoughts about being a theologian of the street, of the sanctuary, of the world, please stop by. We have our flyer up. We have various offerings. You can audit a course. You can come in and enroll, work on a Master of Christian Arts, Master of Divinity, or if you are so inclined to go deeper, a Doctor of Ministry. So again, on behalf of Memphis Theological Seminary, we are grateful to our panelists. We thank each one of you who stopped by to visit with us and to share with us. And we hope to see you again very soon, either virtually or in person, if the pandemic permits and God so orders. Again, thank you all, and God bless you. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.